In this lesson series, we're going to examine an ancient question. Why do we breathe? Now, it took many centuries to figure this out. Most importantly, because the modern scientific approach to questions like this didn't emerge until the 1500s and 1600s. But ancient peoples had many ideas about the functioning of body organs, and we'll tell that story in this series. But first, some background on the scientific approach to understanding nature. You'll recall we learned, what do we mean by A causes B? In science, we want to try to understand the world. We want to explain what's happening in the world. To explain something is to give the cause of something. So first, we better get a handle on what we mean when we say A causes B. And here's one attempt to define that. 3 parts. A must come before B. And if A and B are not happening, then supplying A should lead to B. And if A did not happen, B would not have happened. And we can see then the definition of what we mean by A causes B naturally leads to an experimental approach. We can set up 2 conditions to see if something does indeed cause something else. And when we set up these 2 conditions, we call this an experiment. So if our hypothesis is that a certain virus causes COVID-19, A causes B, then we can set up 2 conditions, one where we supply A, the virus, and one where we do not supply A, the virus. By the way, the A factor would be called the variable. So here we have 2 groups, and the experimental condition would be the group where the A is supplied, so the virus is given to these people. That's the variable. So supplying A should lead to B. If this hypothesis is true, these people should get COVID-19. But we compare the outcome of this group to another group where we do not give them the virus. So we're blocking A in a sense. And so that should not lead to B. So these people should not get COVID-19. That's called the control condition. It lacks the variable. So you see then the definition of what we mean by A causes B is revealed in the structure of an experiment itself. One group we supply A, one group we block A. We also learned about a scientific thinking format, and this allows us to follow the logic of this scientific approach. So if the hypothesis is true that A causes B, and we do some kind of experiment where we're setting up conditions, one that has A, one that doesn't have A, then we should make a prediction. Certain things should happen. Then we compare the result to the prediction, and if the result matches the prediction, we say the hypothesis is supported. That would be an interpretation. And if the result does not match the prediction, then the hypothesis is weakened. That's another kind of interpretation. So let's return then to the question, why do we breathe? And we'll set the historical stage by introducing some of the ideas of ancient peoples. In ancient Egypt, for example, when someone died, they would prepare the body through this mummification process to preserve the body. And in the process, they would remove some of the organs and put them in these jars that would rest alongside the body. Interestingly, the heart would be put back into the body. It was thought to hold a record of good and bad deeds. So it was preserved and returned to the body so that it could be weighed in the afterlife. Now, obviously, the ancient Egyptians had a very different idea what the heart was doing than we do in modern times. Today, we think of the heart as a muscle, and it's pumping blood around the body. It's certainly not thought to be making a record of our moral behavior in our lifetime. And interestingly, the Egyptians apparently did not hold the brain in high esteem. They pulled it out through the nasal cavity and then just discarded it. Well, if we advance in time a little bit to the ancient Greeks, we encounter people like Anaximenes. And he had a proposal for why we breathe. He said something like this: breathing maintains life because it takes in a life-giving substance. Let that sink in. Breathing maintains life because it takes in a life-giving substance. I suppose he might have formulated this idea upon witnessing interactions like this. Sometimes humans, when they interact, it can be violent. And so here we have one person restricting the airway of another person. And if you do that for long enough, people do indeed die. So if we think about Anaximenes' hypothesis that breathing maintains life because it takes in a life-giving substance, we could rewrite it as a form of A causing B. A life-giving substance, A, causes life, B. You might be thinking there's a problem with this. it's as if it doesn't really say much about what's going on. Now, philosophers might say that it is minimally falsifiable, and this is not a good thing. We want hypotheses to be falsifiable, which means they have the possibility of being false. Well, for this hypothesis, very little could weaken it. There is one thing, though, that could weaken it. Could we find some human being that upon restricting their airway, they do not die? Well, that would falsify the hypothesis. That would show that there are some people who do not need to breathe to stay alive. But of course, we don't see such people. We've never encountered any such people. So while Anaximenes' hypothesis does say something about what we observe, people who are blocked from breathing, they do die, it's not a really good hypothesis. Very little could weaken it. It's very general. There are no specific predictions about what we might find if we open up the body and start poking around. It doesn't say much about what breathing is really doing. So while it might be true in a certain sense, it's not real helpful in understanding what's going on. And it doesn't give us a satisfying answer to the question, why do we breathe? Now, if we move forward in time, we'll encounter two more Greek thinkers, very important thinkers in the history of Western philosophy, Plato and his disciple Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had wide-ranging interests, including biology, and so he is going to propose a more specific function for the role of breathing. Now, Aristotle believed there was a heat generated in the heart, this biological heat that was necessary for digestion, movement, and reproduction. And the function of breathing was to cool the heart. So the air brought in during breathing provided for this cooling system so that biological heat didn't get too hot. The heart might get too hot and burn itself out if we didn't have this constant flow of air down through the lungs. Now that is an improvement because it makes more specific predictions. For example, that when we do block the airway, then the heart should heat up. Aristotle was not able to do that kind of experiment, but you see an experiment could be done to test that hypothesis. And so let's take this opportunity then to sort of make a distinction between sort of philosophy and science. The Greeks were great thinkers, but they were not in the habit of doing systematic experiments to test their ideas. So let's take a moment to compare philosophy and science. Well, what is philosophy? Literally, it means sort of the love of wisdom. And I just pulled some sort of quotes from the internet here in some general thoughts on what philosophy is. In a broad sense, philosophy is an activity people undertake when they seek to understand fundamental truths about themselves, the world in which they live, and their relationships to the world and to each other. It's a systematic study of ideas and issues, a reasoned pursuit of fundamental truths, a quest for a comprehensive understanding of the world, a study of principles of conduct, and much, much more. Philosophers explore questions about the meaning of justice, the nature of knowledge, and the purpose of human existence. Philosophers seek answers to questions like, what do we mean by A causes B? What is knowledge? What is truth? What makes an action good or bad? What is virtue? What is a just society? What is the meaning of life? So when we ask what are philosophers doing, they are doing some powerful thinking, and we can see sort of elements of our scientific thinking format in the philosophical game. Lots of philosophers are doing sort of if-then reasoning. We'll say that this is a form of logical reasoning. So it might go something like this, if you believe idea X to be true, then you should believe idea Y to be true as well, and idea Z to be false. Or if you think concept X means A, then you must think concept Y means B. And so this is powerful thinking, what philosophers are doing. And we can see some of it in this kind of if-then reasoning. So basically, if a given statement is true, then sort of we're asking what other statements are true as well. And so in philosophy, it's as if we're testing ideas against other ideas. We're analyzing our concepts, the meanings of the words and the ideas that we produce. Notice, we're not out there in the world manipulating the world. We're not setting up two groups. We're not interfering with processes in nature. We're not getting our hands dirty out there in the physical world. We can sit in our comfortable chair and do philosophy by thinking and conversing and arguing. Of course, in science, then we have a different approach to understanding the world. There are different sets of questions that scientists are interested in. So scientists are not typically doing experiments to figure out the meaning of life, right? Science is about understanding our world and ourselves included. But to understand our world, then, the scientific approach is to formulate specific hypotheses that say something like A causes B. And here's the critical thing that was absent in ancient times: doing experiments, testing ideas against the results of observations and experiments. So remember, philosophers are sort of testing ideas against other ideas. Here, scientists are testing ideas against the world, against nature, what nature is revealing to us as we go out there and mess with nature in what we call experiments. So in science, we don't just think about ideas and concepts. We interact with nature to eliminate our misunderstandings of nature. So by far, the most of the hypotheses ever produced by scientists in the history of thinking have been shown to be false because they are contradicted by the results of experiments. So what we think is true today in science, well, these are the ideas that have withstood the tests, all the experiments that could potentially weaken those hypotheses, but they didn't. They supported those hypotheses. So it's as if these are the ideas that are left standing after we apply this scientific filter to any idea that is proposed to explain something in nature. So what a powerful approach. And the ancient folks were doing some powerful thinking. They were philosophers, but they were not systematically doing experiments to test ideas in an attempt to understand our natural world.